Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Bruchim Abam, Shalom Aleichem to the Kollel Agar de Pirka. Monday afternoon, National Shiur, Parshas Boy. We have some very important announcements before we begin. Firstly, I want to take this opportunity to let everybody know that our upcoming Yarchei Kala is at capacity. Baruch Hashem, we sold out all our rooms. If anybody would like to join, we still have the option of procuring a few more rooms, but we are at capacity. It's an amazing program, and if you'd like to join, don't get locked out. We have, if you didn't yet get the Sefer on Chinuch Habanim, V'Zakini Legado, that's available on our site with free shipping, rabbidg.com. We're now learning Sefer Shemos. If you'd like the Sefer on Shemos, Maggid Harakiah on Shemos, that is available. Upcoming, Tu B'Shvat. Don't forget, The Light and the Splendor is the art scroll book on Chanukah and Tu B'Shvat. And of course, upcoming is Purim. So we have for art scroll the concealed and the revealed. And we are now reprinting the first printing of Maggid Harakiah. The very first sefer we came out with in Tavshin Ayin Tes was Maggid Harakiah on Purim. Baruch Hashem, Kalam and Ashuk. It's not available anymore. It's completely sold out. We're reprinting it for this upcoming Purim. If anybody wants to participate in upcoming publications, the Ben La'ashri, Ala Torah, the Tzipisa Yeshua, upcoming for this coming 3 weeks. Translating the Haggadah and translating Rabbi Meir into Yiddish, please contact us if you'd like to join any of these opportunities. Okay, we have an amazing topic today, and we're going to speak about the role of Makkas Bechoros in Judaism. We know that Makkas Bechoros was one of the Makkas, the 10th Makkah, maybe the most severe of all the Makkas. In Va'era, Rashi says on the words as Kol Magei Foisai that Makkas Bechoros is the equivalent of all the Makkas. But nevertheless, we want to try to understand the role of Makkas Bechoros in the history and destiny of the Jewish people. The Gemara tells us in Brachos on Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Amar Rabba Bar Chinina Saba Mishmei de Rav. Rabba Bar Chinina Saba said in the name of Rav, Kol Shaloi Amar Emes V'Yatziv Shachris. Anyone who does not say Emes V'Yatziv in the morning, Ve'emes Ve'emuna Arvis, Lo Yatzo Yidei Chayvasai. Anyone who does not say Emes V'Yatziv in the morning, Emes Ve'emuna in the evening, has not fulfilled their obligation. We're all familiar. We know that we need to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim daily. Leman tizkar yom seischa me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. You need to remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life, and we are Mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim daily. Nevertheless, the Gemara tells us that is not sufficient. It's not enough just to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. If you did not say Emes V'Yatziv in the morning, Emes Ve'emuna in the evening, you are not Yoitze Your Chiyuv. Shenemar, Lehagid Ba'avoker Chastecha, to relate in the morning your kindness, Ve'emunascha Ba'leilos, and your faithfulness in the night. Says Rashi, what does it mean, Lehagid Ba'avoker Chastecha? In the bracha of Emes V'Yatziv, it's all about the chesed that Hashem did with our forefathers, that He took us out of Mitzrayim, and He split the sea, and He crossed us over. So now, what exactly are we missing by just saying the pasuk, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Hoitzesi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim Lios Lachem Le'Elokim, Ani Hashem Elokeichem? After all, doesn't that pasuk encompass everything? In that pasuk, it says it all. It says that God took us out of the land of Egypt. What more needs to be added by saying Emes V'Yatziv in the morning, Emes Ve'emuna in the afternoon? So Rashi seems to say that what's being added is the mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's not enough just to say Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Hoitzesi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. You need to say more than that. Namely, you need to say V'yamsuf bakata v'zeidim tibata v'didim hevarta v'yichasu mayam tsareim echa mehem loy noisar. That we say in the morning. So we need to say that in the morning. We need to mention Kriyas Yamsuf, and then in the evening we also mention Kriyas Yamsuf. We say Malchuscha ra'u vanecha boikei ayam lefnei Moshe zeh keli anu v'yamru. So Rabba Bar Chinana Saba says in the name of Rav, it's not enough just to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, but you also must mention Emes V'Yatziv Emes V'Emunah. What does that add? It adds the mention of Kriyas Yamsuf. But the question is that all you're adding? That would be the simple understanding based on Rashi. That if you just say Ani Hashem Lekechem, you don't have a mention of Kriyas Yamsuf. Comes the Torah in Siman Samach Vav, and the Torah says that we find in the Yerushalmi, you need to mention Emes V'Yatziv. You need to mention in Emes V'Yatziv Yetzias Mitzrayim, Malchus, Kriyas Yamsuf, Makkas Bechoros. So what we see that the Torah is adding is that it's not sufficient just to add Kriyas Yamsuf. You also have to mention the plague of the firstborns. Okay, so many are not aware that part of the daily mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim is not just to remember that God took us out of Egypt, but to remember as well that He smote the firstborn. Comes the Mishnah Berurah. By the way, you ever hear of the Mishnah Berurah? The Mishnah Berurah was written by the Chafetz Chaim. The Mishnah Berurah is the halacha. Many people like to learn a lot of things. Many people like to learn Gemara. The thing is, if you just learn Gemara, you have no idea how to be a Jew. You might know Masechtos and you might know Lamdos, but you actually have no idea what to do. So you'll say, well, I'll just do what other people do. Pal, if you do that, you're in big trouble. Judaism is not cultural. There are specific halachic procedures that have to be done. If a Jew doesn't know Mishnah Berurah, you don't know how to wake up in the morning, you don't know how to put on tzitzis, you don't know how to wear a tefillin, don't say, no, I know, I was told by my bar mitzvah. If you want, I'll come over, I'll show. If you don't know the Mishnah Berurah, you don't know how to put on tefillin. You don't know where to put on your tefillin. Don't say, this guy told me, that guy told you. You have no idea if they told you the right thing. You have to know what the halacha says. Reb Volba says there are 4 things every Jew needs to know. Mesilas Yesharim, Chumash with Rashi, Chumash the Ramban, Perkei Avos with Rabbeinu Yonah, and Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah says something very important, that he quotes the Torah. The Torah says, Kasav HaTorah b'Shem HaYushalmi, Tzarech lahazker Emes V'Yatziv Yetzias Mitzrayim. You have to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim and Emes V'Yatziv, Umalchus. You have to mention God's sovereignty, Ukriyas Yamsuf, Makkas Bechoros, Umashma Berashba. The Rashba implies Dili Kuvahu Afilu Dieved, that it's Ma'akev even B'Dieved. If you did not say Emes V'Yatziv and mention Makkas Bechoros, you are not Yotzei the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim even B'Dieved. Okay, that is the Psak of the Mishnah Berurah. Now, the Mishnah Berurah though has a kasha. The kasha is based on the Gemara in Brachas Daf Yudal Amud Beis. The Gemara says, Chia Barav Amar. Chia Barav says, Amar Ani Hashem Lekeichem. If you said Ani Hashem Lekeichem, Tzarech Loimar Emes. You have to say Emes. If you say Ani Hashem Lekeichem, you must say Emes. Lo Amar Ani Hashem Lekeichem. If you don't say Ani Hashem Lekeichem, you don't have to say Emes. Says the Gemara, what do you mean that you're saying that it's discretionary whether you say Ani Hashem Lekeichem? You only need to say Emes if you say Ani Hashem Lekeichem, and if you don't say Ani Hashem Lekeichem, you don't need to say Emes. But don't you have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim? Isn't there a mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim? What do you mean you only have to say Emes if you say Ani Hashem Lekeichem? But you have to say Ani Hashem Lekeichem. Says the Gemara, no, you could be Yotzei the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim a different way. How? The Amar Hachi, you say as follows: Moidim anachnu lach Hashem Elokeinu. I thank you, Hashem our God, Shahoitzeisanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, that you took us out of the land of Egypt. Uftisanu mibeis avadim, and you redeemed us from the house of servitude. Ve'asisa lanu nisim, and you made miracles. Ugvurois alayam, and wonders on the sea. V'sharanu lach, and you freed us. So now, if the Torah is correct, that if you don't mention Makkas Bechoros, you're not Yotzei Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, then how could you be Yotzei Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with this little tefillah? Moidim anachnu lach, Hashem Elokeinu, shehoitzeisanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, uftisanu mibeis avadim, ve'asisa lanu nisim ugvurois alayam, v'sharanu lach. How could you be Yotzei with that? There's no mention of Makkas Bechoros. This is the kasha of the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim says, v'tzorchion, it's a tzorchion mi berachos daf yudanim beis b'Gemara. V'ha boilad kure, the Gemara asks, why are you saying Ani Hashem Elokeichem is optional? Don't you need to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim? And the Gemara says, you said a little tefillah. Namely, Ritzon Eloymar, Micha Moicha Ad Soif HaBracha. Micha Moich Ben Hashem, Micha Moicha Neder V'Kosh, Nor Sus Azor, Malsor, V'nech Ben Avnei Moshe, Zeh Keli. But the question is, L'fi Zeh Chasar Makkas Bechoros. Basically, the Mishnah Berurah is asking, he's asking a kasha on the Rashba. The Rashba says that if you don't mention Makkas Bechoros, it's ma'akev, you're not yotzei the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. But the Gemara says that all you got to do is say, thank you Hashem for taking me out of Egypt, redeeming me from servitude, and making all these miracles. So we see that Makkas Bechoros is not ma'akev. So what we would like to try to do today is to answer the Mishnah Berurah's kasha on the Rashba. The Rashba paskins that if you don't say and mention Makkas Bechoros, you are not yotzei the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. And yet the Gemara has formulated a little tefillah that by saying this tefillah, you're yotzei Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and there doesn't seem to be any mention of Makkas Bechoros in this tefillah. So let us begin with the comments of Chidushe Maran Riz Halevi on Shemais, the Brisker Rav, in the little black Brisker Rav ala Torah. In Parshas Shemais, the pasuk says, "Re'ei nisaticha Elohim lefarai." See, I have made you a ruler. Rashi says, "Shoifet v'roida lerdoisai b'makas v'yisurin." I have made you a ruler to Parai. What does God mean? Re'ei nisaticha Elohim lefarai. What does that mean? Moshe is an Aleph Lamed Hey Yud Mem to Parai. He's a ruler. He dominates him. Comes a Brisker Rav and he says, don't make a mistake and think the purpose of the Makkas was to get the Egyptians to send us out of Egypt. Oh no, that was not the purpose of the Makkas. The Makkas were not for the objective of that the Egyptians send us out. The Makkas were performed to smite the Egyptians, because God had prophesied before. V'games hagoya asher yavodu dan anochi, that the nation that afflicts you, I will judge them. So the Makkas were just punishment. They were not constructive. They were destructive. They were a punishment. They were not for an objective that they should send us out. It's v'games hagashe avodu dan anochi, and then you're going to go out. Therefore, Hashem made Moshe Rabbeinu a dayan, a shoifet, to afflict and dominate the Egyptians with Yisurim, to fulfill v'games hagashe avodu dan anochi. And this would ultimately prepare for their ultimate going out. Like it says in Idyos, the mishpat, the judgment of the Egyptians in Egypt was 12 months. So the Makkas were mishpat and din, not for the objective of them sending us out. That's why it says by each Makkah, Paroi, his avadam, his servants, each one was smitten in accordance with what they deserved. By the way, in the Chidushe Hagriz ala Torah, in the stencil on the Haggadah, on his comments on the Haggadah, he says, in the Dayenu, even though you're thinking, Dayenu, what? Pesach is so far away. No, it's not. Pesach is in 10 weeks or 10 and a half weeks or so. Okay, I said, well, where'd you go? I see a guy just dropped out. I think he went to start cleaning already. He didn't realize Pesach was coming. But in the Dayenu we say, Ilu asa bahem shvatim v'loy harag es b'chayreim Dayenu. Ilu harag es b'chayreim v'loy nasan lanu asman Dayenu. We break up the shvatim and Makkas Bechoros. So the Brisker Rav asks, why do we say asa bahem shvatim and harag es b'chayreim separately? Wasn't Makkas Bechoros one of the Makkos? So the Brisker Rav says yes, it was one of the Makkos. But the purpose of the Makkos, like we just mentioned, was not for Pari to send us out. It was merely to punish the Mitzrayim. The Makkos were midin mishpat to make us serve. The Makkos were to subjugate the Mitzrayim and to punish them and to afflict them. But Makkas Bechoros had a dual purpose. It was one of the Makkos, and it was to punish and afflict the Egyptians. But Makkas Bechoros specifically, it says, Shalach b'ni v'yavduni v'atima'in l'shalachai hine anoichi horiges b'chorecha. The Makkas Bechoros was because they were not sending us out. So Makkas Bechoros had a dual purpose. It was a punishment and to get us to leave. But, we have to understand the opinion of the Rashba. The Rashba said that if it's not enough to remember every day that God took us out of Mitzrayim, but if you don't mention Makkas Bechoros, lo yatsa. Why? Why is it so essential to remember Makkas Bechoros? I understand why it's so important to remember that God took us out of Egypt. It's one of the fundamentals of our Emunah. Like the Ramban says, it verifies all the great principles of Judaism, God's reality, His ability, His foreknowledge, His power, prophecy. But there's no mitzvah you have to mention, you have to remember every day kinim, or the wild animals. There's no halacha that every day you have to remember that how did the wild animals get into the Egyptians' homes? They sent an octopus. God sent an octopus with its suction cup tentacles. It sucked out the lock, picked the lock, and then the polar bears came in. You're not mechuyev to remember that every single day. Even though it's said in one of the illustrated Makos books, it has that imagery. There's no biblical mitzvahs, no chiyuv d'oraisa every day to remember the wild animals. There's no chiyuv d'oraisa to remember the darkness every day. All you need to remember in a general sense is that God took us out of Egypt. So why is it essential to mention Makkas Bechoros? Even if you'll say, like the Brisker Rav, that Makkas Bechoros had a dual purpose. It was given as a punishment to the Egyptians. It was also a way of encouraging them to send us out. Very nice. But why, of all the myriad of details of Yetzias Mitzrayim, is Makkas Bechoros so essential that if you don't remember it, you are not Yotzei? That if you don't remember it, you're not Yotzei. In fact, the Rabbi Kiva Eger in Chaim Siman Samach Zayin brings the psak of the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says that if you don't say Ani Hashem Elokeichem Asher Hotzeichi Escha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, if you don't remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, but you do remember Kriyas Yamsuf by saying Az Yashir, you're Yotzei. Do you remember that Magen Avram? The Magen Avram says that if you don't remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, but you remember specifically the splitting of the sea, you're Yotzei. And Rabbi Kiva Eger quotes his son-in-law, the Av Bezin of Preshburg, the Chassam Sofer, who asked, how would it be enough to remember Kriyas Yamsuf? But the Torah is makbid. Leman tiskar es yoim tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim. You have to remember the day you left Egypt. And the splitting of the sea was not the day we left Egypt. It was 7 days later. So how could we understand the psak of the Magen Avram that you're yotzei the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim by remembering Kriyas Yamsuf? That's not yoim tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim. Rabbi Kiva Eger says that Chassam Sofer is correct. Because if you look in the Medrash explicitly says, if you say Shema, you still have to mention Kriyas Yamsuf, and Makkas Bechoros, Be'emes V'yatziv, and if you didn't mention Makkas Bechoros, Lo Yatza. Which the Shevet HaLevi asks, that has nothing to do with the discussion at hand, that if you don't mention Makkas Bechoros, Lo Yatza. The question is that do you need to mention Kriyas Yamsuf? So the Shevet HaLevi changes the Girsa actually. The Shevet HaLevi says that the Girsa that Rabbi Kiva Eger is quoting, in other words, what Rabbi Kiva Eger wants to prove is that it's not essential to mention Kriyas Yamsuf. The Girsa should be, if you didn't mention Kriyas Yamsuf, Yatza, and if you didn't mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, La Yatza. If you look at number 14, that the Shevet HaLevi says, he brings a medrash, that if you didn't mention Makkas Bechoros, La Yatza, that the medrash, it says the opposite, and the Shevet HaLevi says he would say it's a Ta Sofer, that if you didn't mention Makkas Bechoros, you are Yotzei, but if you didn't mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, La Yatza. Be it as it may, asks Rabbi Yerucham Oshen, if anything, it's the opposite. How could it be? Isn't it Ibcha Mistabra? Kriyas Yamsuf, which was the Gemara of Yetzias Mitzrayim, should be more chamor than Makkas Bechoros, which is only a detail of the Yetzia. And yet, if you don't mention Kriyas Yamsuf, you're not. If you don't mention Kriyas Yamsuf, the halacha is maybe. Meaning, how could it be? Kriyas Yamsuf is the Gemara Hashlama. So that I understand, maybe you would have to mention Kriyas Yamsuf. But why would you have to mention Makkas Bechoros? Okay, that's the question really. The Rashba is of the opinion that if you don't mention Makkas Bechoros, you are not Yotzei in the mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzayim. Why? Makkas Bechoros is only a small detail, a small fragment, a small aspect of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why is it Ma'akev that if you don't remember it, you are not Yotzei? So friends, we are now going to reveal and discover the essential role that Makkas Bechoros played in the Exodus and in the whole history and destiny of the Jewish people. On Seder night, on the second kos of wine, we make the bracha Asher Ga'alanu, we say Baruch Atah Hashem, and we say, we thank Hashem Al Geula Seinu V'Al Pedus Nafshenu, on our Geula and our Pedus. Geula is redemption. Pedus is a rescue of sorts. What is the difference between Geula and Pedus? In the Haggadah Shel Pesach Mi Beis Levi, they cite Reb Chaim Brisker that Geula is fundamentally different than Pidyon. Geula we find by a field. A field that's a stei achuzah, an ancestral field, returns to the original owner in Yovel. It says about the field, Geula Tialai. What does Geula mean then? Nothing changes essentially to the field. When the field was sold, it was by one owner. When it goes back to the original owner, the field is not fundamentally changed, it's just transferred. Geula means transfer of domain. Pidyon, we find by Meiser Sheni or Hektish. Pidyon means something is effectuated to the essence of the item, something changes about the status of the item. When it comes to the slavery and freedom of the Jewish people, there were two things. One is, we were working for Parai. We were doing service to Parai. And the second is we were slaves to Parai. Meaning, the first thing is we were slaves. Whether we actually did work or we didn't do work, that's a separate discussion. The first is we had the status of slaves. That was our name. That was our status. That was our essence. That was our nomenclature. That's what we were called. That's who we were. We were slaves. And the second thing is, practically, we were serving Parai. Now, when we were freed, two things happened. Number one, we were no longer serving Parai. We did not have to make pyramids and wake up early in the morning and sweat, and we weren't brutalized. And number two, we were no longer the avadim of Parai. Now we became, in name, the avadim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whether we were serving Parai or not, we were his avadim. And with Yetzias Mitzrayim, we were no longer his avadim. Now we're the avadim of Hashem. I'll give you an example. In 1492, during the Spanish expulsion, Inquisition, we were under the domain of the Emperor of Spain, and he decreed that we either convert or we have to leave the country. And that continued in effect for hundreds of years. And even though many Jews went to the New World, and they may have went to Puerto Rico, Barbados, Brazil, still they were under the sword of the Inquisition. And that continued until the 20th century, until it was rescinded. Whether or not we had to serve the Emperor of Spain or we had to do anything about it, but we were still under his auspices. So too in Mitzrayim, there were two elements of the Avdos. One is, in name, we were the Avadim of Parai, and two, we practically were serving Parai. We were working for him, irrespective of what our status was. So when God freed us, the first thing was, we don't have to serve him anymore. Now we have free time. Now we could get up a little bit later. Now we're not being brutalized. Now we don't have to make the pyramids. But even so, in name, we're Avdei Parai. We're still the slaves of Parai. So God had to extricate us from that status of being the slaves of Parai. We were Becheftza Avdei Parai. That's what we say in our tefillah. Mi Mitzrayim ge'al tanu Hashem Elokeinu. From Egypt, you did geula on us, meaning we used to work in Egypt, and now we no longer work in Egypt. But we're still, in name, the slaves of Parai. No, umi beis avadim pidisanu. You also redeemed us from the house of bondage. You extricated us from the status of being labeled Avdei Parai. That Chevtza of Avdus was removed, and now it is Chal on us, the status of being a Ben Chayren. Mi Mitzrayim Ge'altanu. We no longer serve Parai in practicum. And then Umi Beis Avadim Pidisanu. Okay. The Medrash says that Moshe Rabbeinu told Parai, say to us, Harei atem b'rshuschem, harei atem avadim shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Say, you're in your own domain. You're the servants of God. So Paro started to scream, yesterday you were my slaves. Yesterday you were indentured to me. And now you're free. Oh, so now we understand what we say in the Haggadah. Haitzianu me'avdus lecheros umishibud legeula. Avdus is practically working. Cherus is no longer working. Shibud is the status of being an Eved. I'm sorry. Avdus is the status of being an Eved. And Cherus is freedom from that status. Shibud is practically working. Geula is not working anymore. Or we say, Noidelcha al geula seinu. Geula is no longer needing to work practically. Pedus nafshenu is we are freed from the status of being avadim. That's what we say in Berachas Hamazon every day. You took us out of Egypt. Once we're out of Egypt, then we don't work anymore. But we still may in name be indentured slaves to Parai. No, Uftisanu, you did pidyon on us, mi beis avadim. The Yitzia Me'aretz Mitzrayim is, now we don't have to work for him anymore. Uftisanu mi beis avadim, now we are free. Bechefza, we no longer have the status of being avadim to him. Now we are Avdei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the question is, it comes out there are two aspects of the Exodus. One is, we used to have a hard life, and now practically we're free. It doesn't mean that we're no longer avodim in name. And you see, the problem with being an eved in name is that if we're still Paro's official eved, at any time ever in future, he could come back and get us. So at what point in time did we leave Mitzrayim and we don't have to work for him anymore? And at what point in time was the pidyon, was the redemption, that the status of being avodim to Paroi was removed? So if you look in Parshas Re'eh, V'hanavi hahu oicholeim hachaloim hahu yumas ki diber sara al Hashem Elokeichem hamoitzi eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim v'hapoidecha mi beis avodim. We talk about God who took us out of Mitzrayim and redeemed us from the house of servitude. Says the Gaon Adaras Eliyahu, there were two Geulas in Yetzias Mitzrayim. One was the nighttime. That's the beginning of the Geula that Moshe said to Paroi in the night. If you want to be exempt from the Makkas, you have to say, B'nei Choyrem Atem, you got to free us. And in the morning we left. Regarding the night, was the pidyon of Klal Yisrael. The pidyon we're saying is when we were extricated from the label and the status of being as avadim. How were we extricated from the status of being avadim of Hashem? With Makkas Bechoros. Kol Bechoreim haragta uvecharcha ga'alta. The geula of the day is when we left. Once we leave, we don't have to serve him anymore. That's the hamoitzi acha me'eretz Mitzrayim. You see, the pidyon, how did the pidyon take effect? How were we extricated from being avadim to Paroi, and we became avadim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How did that legal transfer, meaning geula is we used to work and now we're not working anymore, and practically speaking. But how did the status, the former status of being avadim to Paroi, how are we extricated from that? That was through the process of Makkas Bechoros. The Gra says that really the decree was on the Jewish firstborn as well. And we were switched. There was like an exchange that the Egyptian firstborn took our place. That was the pidyon. So we were extricated from the status of being avodim to Paroi at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So there are two critical elements of the Exodus. You have the practical freedom. We were enslaved. We were doing work. We were serving, and now we are no longer serving. So practically speaking, we're not working. But in terms of having the status of being an eved to Paroi, that was not lifted. That was only lifted with Makkas Bechoros. So now we understand that Makkas Bechoros is not just a detail in the Exodus, but Makkas Bechoros effectuated a critical component of the Exodus. In terms of the practical, that stopped when we left. But But in terms of the reality of our essence, that we used to be Avadim to Parai and now we're Avdei Hashem, that was not effectuated until Makkas Bechoros. In the Navi Yeshaya it says, Ki ani Hashem Elokecha, Kadosh Yisrael Moshiacha, Nasati Chafrecha Mitzrayim. I gave your koifer in Egypt. Rashi says in Yeshaya, Vehem hayu lecha lepidyon shebechoreya mesu. They were your pidyon, that their firstborn died, and you, my firstborn Jewish people, were saved. You really deserve to be destroyed, like it says, Lishbay Chamase Aleim Eretz Yisrael. Really, I was going to pour my wrath on you, but instead of it going on you, it went on the Egyptians. And when that happened, you were extricated from the status of being Avadim. So what we're learning is that the plague of the firstborn was not a detail. Yeah, there was blood, and there were lice, and there were wild animals, and there was no. There are two main elements of the Exodus. There's the practical freedom, and then there's the freedom from the name of being Avadim to Parai. And Makkas Bechoros is what effectuated the pidyon. So now we understand the opinion of the Rashba that we paskin this way, that in order to fulfill Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's not enough just to remember, we were, I'll give you an example, Lahavdil. If a guy runs out of jail, he's not in jail. But if the jail still has him on the roster, even if he runs to a foreign country, there's always a fear they could come back and get him. If somebody if a hostage escaped Gaza and they're running away, there's always a fear, maybe they'll come get him back. It's not enough to be practically free. You need to be lifted and extricated from that status. What extricated the Jewish people from the status of being Avadim to Parai is the plague of the firstborn. And therefore, if you just remember God took us out, that's only a half a job. Very nice, God took us out. But we're still, in name and in reality, slaves to Parai. So it's critical to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, this explains the opinion of the Rashba, why Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim is so critical. Why Makkas Bechoros is so critical to Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. But comes Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the Yarech L'Moyadim, and he says we can now offer a stunning answer to the Kasha of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah asked on the Rashba that the Gemara says that even if you don't mention Ani Hashem Elokecha Mashar Tzeitzei Eschem Eretz Mitzrayim, you could still be yotzei the mitzvah with the following tefillah: Moidim anachnu lach Hashem Elokeinu shehotzei sanu me'eretz Mitzrayim ufti sanu mibeis avadim v'asisa lanu nisim u'gvuros al hayam v'sharanu lach. Frak the Chavetz Chaim, what do you mean? How could you be yotzei Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with this tefillah, but you forgot to mention Makkas Bechoros? Says Hagon Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, you forgot to mention Makkas Bechoros. What's the reason you need to mention Makkas Bechoros? Why is Makkas Bechoros such an essential part of remembering the Exodus? Because it's not enough just to remember practically we went out, Shahid Seisanu. You also need to remember that God lifted our status as slaves to Paro. You have to remember the pidyon. Well, look at this tefillah. In the tefillah we say, Moedim anachnu lach Hashem Elokeinu, Shahid Seisanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, ufti sanu mibeis avadim. The pidyon mibeis avadim, that is what the essential commemoration needs to be. It's not that you have to remember the death of the plague of the firstborn per se. It's not that you have to remember the firstborn died per se. It's you remember that to remember that not only did God take us out practically, He removed us from the status of being Avdei Parai. That's the pidyon. It's not enough to remember Geula. You also have to remember the pidyon. So says Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in this tefillah, clearly articulates that the pidyon, shoitzei sanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, ufti sanu beis avadim. That's why every day in benching we say, al shoitzei sanu Hashem Elokeinu me'eretz Mitzrayim, ufti sanu mi beis avadim. That's how we say in the morning, mi Mitzrayim ge'al tanu, umi beis avadim pidi sanu. And I think it's very beautiful. In the nighttime, we remember in Emes Ve'emunah, Hamakeh be'evrasai kol b'chorei Mitzrayim, when God hit the firstborn, Vayotzei es amo Yisrael mitoicham l'cheiros olam. Then God took us to eternal freedom. Why? Listen to how beautiful the lashon is. You see, if God would just have taken us out, then, okay, he took us out, but maybe they'll come back and get us. After all, we're still his avadim. But Hamakeh be'evrasai kol b'chorei Mitzrayim, when he smote the firstborn, that was paida klal Yisrael. Now we're gone for good. Now vayotzei es amo Yisrael mitoichem l'cheiros olam. Now it's a cheiros olam. Now he can't come back and get us. So whenever we remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, we always remember these two facets: the geula and the pidyon. Al geula seinu v'al pidyon nafshenu. The geula is the practical aspect. The pedus nafshenu is we are extricated from having the status of being avadim to parai. This explains the opinion of the Rashba, and this Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi suggests very beautifully would be an answer to the kasha of the Mishnah Berurah on the Rashba, because indeed, even though we don't mention Makkas Bechoros per se, but we do mention the essential aspect of Makkas Bechoros, which is pedisanu mi beis avadim. Okay, Rabbi Say, have a beautiful day, have a wonderful day, bracha v'atzlacha, and we'll see. Everybody's invited to join us Wednesday night, 8:30. We also have a Shiurim on Wednesday morning at 11:50, 2 short Shiurim. Have a good day, everyone. Bracha v'atzlacha.